This is World Insight. I'm Tian Wei. We begin our program today on efforts to fix trade disputes between China and the United States. Chinese and U.S. officials have wrapped up two-day talks in Beijing. Treasury Secretary from the United States, Steven Mnuchin, led the high-level U.S. delegation, while Liu He, the vice premier in charge of the Chinese economy, is leading the discussions for China. The two sides discussed several points, such as protecting intellectual property rights and many others. Both sides may not have resolved many disputes so far, but they agreed, at least, to keep up the dialogue. Before our discussion, take a look at the latest.
China and the U.S. reached a consensus on their bone of contention at high-level trade talks in Beijing after 2 days of meetings. The two sides fully exchanged views on key points, including U.S. exports to China, bilateral trade in services, two-way investment, intellectual property rights, and tariff measures. They agreed to establish a communication mechanism and keep close contact. But both sides do recognize that they still have major differences to sort out, and they need to keep working on them. In April 2018, the Trump administration has threatened to levy tariffs on up to $150 billion worth of Chinese goods. Beijing retaliated by publishing a list of U.S. imports worth $50 billion and levied a 25% tariff. The trade dispute escalated with the Trump administration's protectionist trade policies. On Thursday, more than 1,000 economists have made public a signed letter they addressed to Mr. Trump and the U.S. Congress, warning of catastrophic consequences if the U.S. insists on pursuing protectionist trade policies. They urge the U.S. president and legislators to step back from tariff threats and not repeat mistakes made in the past.
A joint letter from the U.S. economists pointed out the essence and harm of the tariffs imposed on China by Washington. It once again proved that unilateralism and protectionism are no different to conducting a self-isolating siege. It does not conform to the rules of the market. It will do harm not only to others but also the U.S.
After all that's said and done, trade talks did ease the long-simmering tensions between the two countries. Both parties believe that healthy and stable economic and trade relations between China and the U.S. are very important, and both are committed to fixing these disputes through dialogue and consultation.
So are talks helping ease trade tension between China and the U.S.? Are the two-day talks really bringing us any results? With us here in Beijing, we have Liu Baocheng, who is the Dean of the Center for International Business Ethics from the University of International Business and Economics. Sir, welcome to our program. Joining us in Hong Kong, Hong Hao, Managing Director and Head of Research from Bocom International. In New York, U.S., we have Max Wolf, Professor of Economics from New School University. Gentlemen, welcome. This is a big day. Professor Liu, I want to start with you. But the question is there any real takeaway that would help us to solve, or at least to a certain extent resolve, the trade dispute?
I think there are conditional takeaways. By saying it's condition because it really depends. For example, China agrees to soften the, to re-review the sorghum, the anti-dumping case if they provide more information. So as for other issues, for example, to lower the tariff, China already agreed to lower a number of tariffs, inclusive of the car imports. So those are really the achievement. But as for others, for example, the reciprocal tariff between these two countries, it's really too far a gap.
It seems that you sound very diplomatic in your answer, sir. I have to go to the others to have some direct answer. Mr. Hong, what about you? $200 billion US. The U.S. wants the Chinese side to reduce so-called the trade deficit. China apparently not necessarily is looking eye to eye with the U.S. on this point. What is likely to be the takeaway, you think, of this dialogue?
Yeah, well, I think the target of $200 billion US trade deficit reduction by 2020 is very aggressive. And also, at the beginning of the negotiation, already they're putting onto the table some very unreasonable terms. It makes the negotiation very difficult to carry on. So I would say, it's nice to start a dialogue, but I think, because the two parts are so far apart, it's probably difficult to reach an agreement in a very short period.
As well as we know, Professor Wolf, the delegation from the U.S. is heading in the evening hours of Beijing time on Friday toward home. Do you think there's any achievement that you can see from the American perspective?
Yeah, so I do think there's one achievement, which is it's better to be engaged in talks than not to be engaged in talks. It at least opens the possibility of success. Unfortunately, I think we had a fairly unreasonable and arbitrary number, $100 billion, that we saw being thrown around before for a trade gap close by 2020. It's interesting to remember historically at the end of World War II, when the international trade architecture was set up, the United States, then the big surplus country, came in and made the global order such that it is the deficit country in trade, not the surplus country, by all the architecture erected, ironically, by the U.S. over the last 70 years, that's asked to balance. So now we ironically come back, we contradict 70 years of American trade policy, and we pull a super aggressive number, $100 billion out of a hat, then we double it on our trip there. So I don't think that what we've done with our chance to talk was very positive or very productive, but I do think we should at least pause and say, as long as we're in talks, it is certainly much better than trading threats or trading tariffs, which we were doing before.
Well, even with talks, it does not mean that there will not be future trading of threats and future trading of tariffs, I have to say, unfortunately. Having said that, though, Professor Liu, we understand there's a petition letter coming from hundreds of economists coming from the United States and all over the world talking about what are we facing right now with this kinds of threat coming from one country to another country when it comes to trade policy and also economic development agenda. Some are suggesting this is dragging all of us going back to before the Second World War, in which there was a devastating situation of the U.S. trade as a result of certain legislation then. And they believe this could be a repetition of that possibility. Professor Liu, having said that, though, I want to ask from the Chinese perspective, engaging in discussions like this bilaterally, does it mean that China accept the way that the U.S. interact, particularly over the past 2 years?
Well, I think great leaders make a difference over the rhetoric of politicians, because great leaders will have to listen to their people. And now with the trade issues, they have to listen to business people that they claim to be there to protect their interest. So now the also economists, the business people, they almost have a consensus that a trade tariff is really harmful to its own nation. And now, it is really there to reflect that who are really there doing the right type of job and adopting the right type of approach. So by reverting this entire approach is really there to move against the history, and also this is going to repeat the lessons that people have already proven to be wrong.
All right, but if China begins to talk to the United States in this way, even though China at this point obviously did not accept this so-called demand coming from the U.S. bilaterally, but does that mean that this is likely to be the way that things are going to work out when it comes to trade issue? Professor Liu, very briefly from you.
I don't think so, because you have to really come to the basic reality and identify who are the causes and who are the consequences, and what really happened.
Right.
So therefore, it is really the structural issue. It's really the the lifestyle issue that in the United States that really contributed to these the trade deficit. So therefore, without really identifying the cause and are so ready to blame others, so that's not really the right legitimate approach to solve problems.
Okay, Mr. Hong, what do you think about the multilateral platform for the future? Is it going to still be legitimate? Is it still going to be with quality after the U.S. Apparently this time with China trying to resort to the bilaterally to begin with?
Yeah, it's going to be very difficult. You know, the way trade deficit is calculated, you know, is by definition, by destination. So basically, the U.S. is calculating, you know, how much goods it's exporting versus how much goods it's importing, and you know, they found out that, you know, 2/3 of its trade deficit is against China. So that is why, you know, we get into this kind of negotiation. Now the problem is that, you know, much of the, well, quite a bit of U.S. goods is actually produced in China. For example, Apple computer, you know, produce a lot of the revenue from China, and also the U.S. auto companies sell more number of cars in China than they sell in the U.S. domestically. So you know, I would say that, you know, if you tally up all the domestic revenue that is generated by the U.S. companies here in China, it's actually quite substantial. You know, if you count those revenue, it will actually reduce the deficit substantially. But you know, it's unfortunate that, you know, the U.S. Economists don't see it that way. So you know, the negotiation is starting on a wrong footing.
I guess a lot of economists are seeing it that way. Only those that are now in the administration is trying to make another point. Professor Wolf,
yeah,
what about
probably.
that petition letter?
Yeah, so I do think that the weight of American economic thinking and the thinking of the field of economics and fields around trade and business is very much on against, sort of on the side of the petition, and very much hostile to and critical of the notion that we're somehow going to tariff our way to a structural economic policy. And I think you could sort of boil it down to the following. The kind of rhetoric that excites Republican primary voters is in no way, shape, or form constructive to global trade, and has really very, very little chance of being good for the U.S., the global, the Chinese economy, or for that matter, the community of nations, which has embraced largely free trade, which has built a lot of the prosperity of the moment, which is now being put at risk. And I think most economists would more or less agree with that statement, and have shown themselves to in petitions, in various interviews, and in the weight of the evidence of this field.
But the question is, Professor Wolf, what's next? Because we could talk about theory. We could talk about the ideal situation. We should talk about theoretical things. But, you know, eventually it is this current White House that is going to decide. And it's very likely that it's the president that's going to decide. And it's also very likely that the team that the president has assembled is likely to have an internal fight, because they have different beliefs when it comes to trade. Some are much more conservative, while others are pretty much liberal in a way when it comes to trade, at least. So let me ask you, Professor Wolf, how do you think this delegation, when they go back to Washington, they're going to brief the president? And how will that decision be made? Will their opinions really matter? Or is it really likely to be a decision made by the president alone? Because the president does have a lot of authority, according to the U.S. way, when it comes to trade.
So you're absolutely right. The president does have strange authority above and beyond what is wise, what is modern, or what you'd expect, as against many other domestic policy matters where there's a more democratic process here. So that's definitely true. It has been the past, and that's all we can use to judge here, that President Trump is clearly not terribly knowledgeable about, not involved in, has no experience, no theoretic knowledge, not much intellectual curiosity or experience in international trade. And that has probably been part of the reason for many of the comments he's made. What he seems to be doing is getting a kind of cabinet of dissent around him to listen to the voices. We can only hope that he does so. But his decision-making in the past has been mercurial, personal, and driven by limited knowledge and introspection on the subject. So if we're going to be completely honest here, we'd have to expect the same going forward.
All right. According to some of the media reports, Mr. Mnuchin, Steven Mnuchin, the Treasury Secretary, was talking about that there has been, quote, a very good conversation when he was asked about what actually is going on in those negotiation rooms with the Chinese side. Mr. Hong, what do you think? I mean, 4 areas it seems that both sides have touched on. That is in the press release. It is about China increasing the export coming from the United States to China. It is about the trade issue when it comes to trade in services. It is about protection of intellectual property rights. It's about a tariff or non-tariff when it comes to trade interactions between the two countries. So what do you think is getting down when we are looking at the future, the points that we should really pay attention to after this round?
Yeah. I think Mr. Mnuchin was being polite, you know, when he said, you know, we had a nice conversation with
I have no idea.
sides. We've
I
seen
don't know.
Yeah. Well, it's difficult to say, what's going on in the room. Now, the thing is that the trade negotiation actually really go well beyond the realm of international trades, in the sense that the U.S. Side is also making demand on Chinese stopping subsidizing some of the technology companies, and also stop its grand national strategy towards Make in China 2025. So this is really way beyond what the normal international trade negotiation involves. So that is the reason why just now I said the two sides are really far apart. Even though we start talking, and I think it will take some time to get the negotiation done.
Professor Liu, what about China after this round of talk? Obviously, whether it is 2025 made in China, or it is about the $200 billion that was reportedly in the demands coming from the U.S. when it comes to reduction of so-called trade deficit from China. Chinese side did not agree with those things. So what do you think could be the next step for the Chinese side? Go on discussing?
Well, China is always ready for sincere discussion, so that's no question about that. It's really what is really the request from the other side. So whether it's legitimate, whether it's really justifiable, so that's a big issue. As for number one, as for the Made in China 2025, I do not think there is any legitimate request to ask China to slow its pace. And yes, they forewarned that China should be careful about another round of excessive capacity. So that's fine. So China can really take it, but this does not really stop China from moving ahead. And the other, approach with regard, to reduce the deficit on the U.S. side. So China is a firm believer of market economy, and it is really the business that are there to decide, or the consumers that are there to decide. So therefore, automatic constraint or the putting on export quota is really an old-fashioned way that U.S. really objected for years. And now, if they really wanted to reinvent it on China, so this is really working against history.
Right. The other thing that we need to talk about, gentlemen, is about this mechanism. That this mechanism will continue. They agree to further discussion and also in communication. But what kind of mechanism are we talking about? Professor Wolf, I want to go to you about this. China and the United States, remember when the two heads of state met? They have agreed about different kinds of dialogues, and none of them happened, apparently, over the past few months. So is this really a picking up of the earlier discussion of mechanism that should have long work and now has a big delay? And once again, we're focusing on the mechanism. Will this time the mechanism be carried out, or once again it will be just thrown away after the talk?
Yeah, so it's very difficult to know in advance. We certainly hope that the mechanism will be carried out. I would circle back to something you said earlier. We do actually have rules and procedures, protocols, and norms for international trade. And one of the more difficult features of the Trump administration for over a year now is they have largely rhetorically rejected and functionally not used those channels. So, for instance, the World Trade Organization sets out various rules, limitations, and norms. We also have multilateral agreements which allow for a more rules-based discussion. And it has been the predilection of President Trump and his administration to sort of rule by tweet, innuendo, accusation, and news brief, and not to rule according to those norms. If this conversation pushes us back onto a multilateral footing in which we engage the usual structures of trade negotiation, I think that would be a very positive development. But I don't see any compelling evidence to know for sure if we've gotten that much progress yet to date.
Okay. Mr. Hong, what's your sense? I mean, earlier we had these different kinds of dialogue between China and the United States, but none of them actually happened. So are we actually, with this round, going back to the earlier commitment that those conversations should happen? If those happened, could we have a different picture?
Yeah, well, we all still remember the good old days. I think when Donald Trump visited China, the Chinese government placed a very large airplane order with the Boeing company. And also when President Xi went to Florida in the U.S. to visit Donald Trump, you know, they had a few very nice rounds of golf. So, you know, seems to be quite pleasant back then. But I think right now, you know, since we have already started the negotiation, you know, even though there is a little bit of hiccup during the first round, but I would say that, you know, there will be more talks going on, and now that we have this channel open. And also China on its own is continuing its reform and open program. You know, we are starting to open up the financial industry that used to be safe, you know, very closely guarded by the government. And also, you know, today, you know, we're already seeing some foreign investment banks making license application to open up branches in China as well. And also, we're lowering the auto importing tariff and all that. So, you know, China is doing on its own, you know, continue to reform and open. And I think that should start the next round negotiation on the right footing, you know, because China has done with its own initiative to do so much.
Okay, Professor Liu, the banking sector that Mr. Hong just talked about, it's now the American banks that is trying to apply. 51% of shares, it is what the UBS, that's a European bank, that is trying to make a difference here, trying to be the first in the line. So if American businesses are really serious about this, they better act. Professor Liu, the thing is, what's going to be next? Is it going to be empty talk, or things are going to be pushed by the real doers?
Well, actually, Donald Trump didn't really like the previous type of mechanism to talk about, you know, the abstract principles and strategies, etc. So he thought that was useless. So either it's the SED or GCCT, etc. But now this type of mechanism, you know, that is newly formed, I would assume that this is going to be a homework check. So to check on the agenda, to check on the progress that is being made. But with all that, whether, you know, but at the moment it's too early to do that because you don't have agreement yet. So how do you really check on it? So therefore, continued dialogue is really expected. So to really to build agreement before you really have a mechanism to check.
All right. Finally, before we go, if I could have the three gentlemen with me right now. Yes, we do right now. And shall we have one sentence from every one of you? What do you think biggest takeaway of this round of discussions? Certainly, people have been watching very closely. Professor Liu, one sentence from you.
Well, respect the reality and be fair.
All right. Mr. Hong?
It could have been much better, but I think the U.S. Is starting on the wrong footing.
Professor Wolf?
We made more of a challenge to success, but at least we're talking.
All right. There we go. With those notes, we're wrapping up this first round of discussion for today. Thank you so much, gentlemen, for being with us. It has been a very eventful week. I hope we all have a great weekend. Thank you, Liu Baocheng, Hong Hao, Max Wolf. Really appreciate it. You're watching World Insight with me, Tian Wei. Still to come on our program.